All right, welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. The Senate has released their blueprint for the big, beautiful bill, a long-awaited version on President Trump's tax agenda. And we heard from GOP Senator, the leader there, John Thune, saying it would bring more a strong and prosperous America. And of course, this ahead of what they're having a deadline of July the 4th. And these big, beautiful bill, they say, which would make the 2017 corporate tax cuts permanent, cut hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicaid spending, and phase out renewable energy cuts enacted under former President Joe Biden. Let's be joined right now by the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors Chair Stephen Miran. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Where exactly does this big, beautiful bill stand in the Senate?
Great. Look, thanks for having me very much. I think it's important to emphasize, though, again, at the start, that the big, beautiful bill will do wonders for the U.S. economy. It'll end up boosting GDP by 4 to 5% over the next 4 years relative to not passing it. It'll create many millions of jobs. It'll create an $8,000 to $13,000 increase in take-home pay for a typical family of four. And what the Senate has done today is to take the first step towards passing the bill itself by releasing the Senate finance provisions. And I think it's a huge step that the Senate took. And now the Senate will go toward debating the bill, and we are on track for moving the bill through Congress on the timeline that we said. So we are optimistic that sort of a few weeks from now, the bill will become law, and it will do an enormous world of good to keep tax rates low for American families, provide further tax relief in the form of no tax and overtime, no tax and tips, tax relief for seniors, for Social Security, create huge incentives for investment. It'll be all sorts of great things will come from this bill.
I want to get into some of the details, the finer points of this blueprint put forward by the Senate. And of course, a lot of conversation around SALT, the state and local tax cap. And there seems to be a wide margin between the House version and the Senate version. The House put forward $40,000. The Senate one only has $10,000. Is that just a placeholder? And how does the Trump administration find compromise in the middle? Where does it find compromise in the middle?
Yeah, so look, I think you have to imagine that both of those are somewhat starting points. The House bill, as you say, has a $40,000 deduction for state and local taxes, starts phasing out at about $500,000 of income, and the Senate bill keeps things as it is right now, which is a $10,000 deduction. It's going to be up to the House and the Senate to find agreement, and it's going to be up to the House and the Senate to work out those differences with each other. But I'm confident that they will, because we all know that not passing a bill at all will lead to the biggest tax hike in history, a $4 trillion tax hike that'll plunge the economy into recession and lose millions of people their jobs. And so, for such a small difference between the House and the Senate, I just have very little doubt that at the end of the day, they'll come to an agreement that seems reasonable to each of them, because the risks of not having the bill at all are just so monumental. It would be suicidal.
Yeah, John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, also echoed a similar sentiment about that. The alternative is pretty dire. I do want to ask you about another component, saying the Senate version also has steeper cuts to Medicaid. Is that something that the Trump administration can also swallow?
Yeah, it does have a little bit, but I think the differences are pretty slight in the scheme of things. And I do think, again, the right way to think about this bill is to what happens if you don't pass the bill. And not only is it the biggest tax hike in history that'll plunge the economy into recession, but if you don't pass the bill, because of the economic downdraft that'll ensue, there's going to be 8 to 9 million people that lose their health insurance, right, altogether, and that would be a big loss.
Yeah, that would be a big loss for so many Americans, and so many Americans are keeping an eye on this, but they're living their day-to-day lives. Another component to the Senate Finance Committee, their plan, their blueprint talks about a $5 trillion debt ceiling increase. Just simplify it for us. Dumb it down a little bit. When we're talking about cutting those tax cuts, why the need to increase the debt ceiling in such a dramatic way?
So you need to increase the debt ceiling to provide space for the economy to grow, because it's normal that debt grows with an economy, and that's why we typically think of the debt as a share of GDP, the debt relative to the size of the economy. Because when the economy grows, it's just natural that things get scaled up by it, that revenues get scaled up by the size of the economy, outlays get scaled up by the size of the economy, and the debt gets scaled up by the size of the economy too. So it's necessary to increase the debt limit to allow for that.
And we saw President Trump talk to different House members to sway some votes to get it through the House. And earlier on today, I did want to put up a post from our colleague over here at Fox, Aisha Hasty, saying Vice President J.D. Vance going into a meeting with GOP senators. How much sway, how much is the Trump administration relying on Vance to get some of those votes? And can you share some of the conversations that you are hoping he has with Democratic or GOP senators to get some of the votes on their side?
Yeah, so look, I think we have to understand that President Trump and Vice President Vance, as part of the administration, President Trump is a closer, Vice President Vance as well, right? These people can close deals, and the president knew that when he needed to act, when he needed to intervene to get the House bill over the line, he knew exactly what he had to do to start making those meetings, making those connections, and push the bill through. And I have no doubt that when we get to the same point in the Senate bill, that the administration will do the same thing, that the president and the vice president will manage to talk to senators and get the bill over the line, because the alternative is really bad of not having a bill. And so we will get the bill over the line. But in order to do that, in order to start intervening that way, we have to move things a little bit along so that we know where the points of disagreement are, we know where the points of contention are, and then we can figure out ways to resolve them.
And we heard from House Speaker Mike Johnson say they had years to work on this to get it through the House. The Senate only has a matter of weeks, and before you know it, it will be July 4th. Do you expect negotiations to really go right up to the wire, right up to July 4th before potentially passing this? Is that what you expect?
Yeah, I think that's fairly likely to happen. I mean, look, we had an ambitious timeline in the House. Right? We had an ambitious timeline for releasing the bill. We had an ambitious timeline for passing the bill by Memorial Day. But even though the timeline was ambitious, we delivered. We did those things, right? The bill passed by Memorial Day in the House, and passing the bill in the Senate by July 4th, enacting the bill by July 4th is also ambitious. But we have a good track record of fulfilling. And you know what? If it ends up passing that deadline by a little bit, it's not the end of the world. We will get this bill done because there is political will to preserve and extend low tax rates, to create American economic prosperity, to create the Trump golden age. And that can only happen if we pass the bill.
And as you mentioned, the alternative might be stark if that does not get done. All right. Chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Miran, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you.